In today's video, we are going to go through a selection of Fey creatures that you need to use in your next Dungeons & Dragons campaign or one-shot. Let's roll that intro. Hello everyone and welcome back to the DMSide. Yes, today we are going to be looking at Fey creatures as we continue our journey through the monster manual, where I've taken some time to select creatures from each different type of monster that you can have, because I believe that there are some that are just being undervalued and underused in D&D as we currently know. So today we're going to be looking at the Fey creatures, and the very first creature that I want to talk to you about is known as the Corrid. Now, a Corrid is not necessarily an evil Fey creature. It is actually a chaotic neutral creature that takes the form, or looks like, a dwarf from afar. However, when you get closer, the difference is quite astounding, as a Corrid is actually, it looks almost like a petrified by Medusa dwarf, because it has this stony exterior. It is an earth elemental Fey creature, and its legs are that of a satyr, so your more hoof legs, I guess you could say. I like to think of that guy from Hercules as the satyr form. Basically him, but a little stony on top. Anyway, a Corrid is a very challenging creature to actually deal with, because not only do they have a high challenge rating of challenge rating 7, so they have a lot of hit points, they have this very magical ability about them where they can conjure elemental creatures, they can summon gargoyles, they can also use things like Pass Without a Trace to sneak away from any enemies. They're very difficult to get your hands on, but why would you want to get your hands on them? Now, that is the interesting part, because dwarves actually absolutely love finding a Corrid. They are almost like natural enemies, because the Corrid can sense and feel gems and rubies and rare metals hidden deep beneath the earth, because they have this affinity to the earth itself. So what you'll usually find is that a Corrid has actually been taken kidnapped by a group of dwarves or Duergar, and they are forced to, almost like a metal detector, show them the way to where great hordes of gems are actually ready to be found and dug up. But what would your players do with these creatures should they ever find one? Yes, you could use them to find a great ruby that perhaps is hidden well beneath the ground in a red dragon's hoard, and so it's one way for your players to find the red dragon that they might be seeking. On top of that, what little people do know is that the Corrid's hair is actually one of the most valuable things that they do have, because whatever you cut the Corrid's hair with, the hair becomes. So, as you would imagine, if you use it to cut the hair with a steel sword blade, the hair would break off into a string of steel. So obviously you can imagine where this goes. People who are extremely greedy will generally want to cut it with some form of gold, sharpened gold. That way they are constantly gaining more gold and things like that. So you could go either way with this, DMs. Your players could be hired to go and actually capture a Corrid. So that way dwarves could use it to find a deep underground hidden hoard of gold and jewels that once belonged to a great city of theirs in ancient times. Or you could use them in a way where your players are saving them because they need to find themselves, as I mentioned before, a great gem that it will essentially lead them to their quarrel, a dragon of sorts, or an evil necromancer, or an underground lair for some other great being. But the whole point is it's centered around this giant crystal that no one can seem to find. However, if you get a Corrid, you can. So, DMs, these are really interesting creatures. They don't need to be considered as evil or good-natured. They are chaotic neutral, so generally it will really come down to how your party converse with them, or what means they will use to try and capture them and, well, force them to do their bidding for the time being. So, consider them for your next campaign. I don't recommend them for a low level unless it's going to be primarily more of your diplomatic talks. And if the Corrid is just going to be like, I'm not interested in this, and leave, rather than not really just kind of like kill them in battle. DMs, the next creature we have is the Yeth Hound. It is pretty common knowledge, or I would say accepted, that the Feywild is considered to be more of a good-natured realm because it is almost the complete opposite of the Shadowfell, which is considered to be your more evil realm. But that's not always the case. The Feywild itself really does clinch itself on a lot of neutral characters, your chaotic neutral Fey elves, and also even your lawful good Fey creatures can become a problem because the laws of the Feywild don't always coincide with the laws of the material plane. But that does also mean that there are evil Fey creatures, and the Yeth Hound are one such thing. Now, before I can get into what they actually do, or what they look like and things like that, I would suggest you don't use these for your low-level players because they are immune to non-magical attacks. And the only other way that you can attack them without magic is if it's a silvered weapon. So DMs, if you're considering running a Yeth Hound, make sure your players have access to some silvered weapons, or they have the ability to enchant their items or make them magical items early on in the campaign, even if it's just temporary. Otherwise, I would suggest if you want your big baddies to have some, hounds, dogs running around, I would suggest leaning more towards the hellhounds as an option. But if you go with your Yeth Hounds, these creatures can be a lot of fun. They're very interesting creatures because they have the body of this huge, bulking dog, essentially. And then on top of that, they have this disgusting, grotesque, like almost human face that looks like it's constantly in pain. These creatures are evil to the core. They love hunting their prey and following them throughout the night, just keeping up with them, making them run on and on and on until eventually they succumb to exhaustion and die. A Yeth Hound's greatest enemy is sunlight, however. If your players are holding them off just for the break of the actual sun itself, then they are able to survive. A Yeth Hound does have a constant telepathic connection with its master, should they be on the same plane of existence, and they can actually appear at their master's side whenever they wish, or whenever their master really wishes it. So these creatures are very versatile. They can also howl this baleful howl that actually travels up to 300 feet, and anyone who hears it can actually be magically feared, where they would have to obviously make a saving throw and avoid being around that creature, which could be really, really interesting because that's quite a large radius, I guess you could say. So Yeth Hounds are really, really cool creatures. They can definitely cause and create this horror theme and this gothic survival feel to your stories. It's just important to know what they're doing. Now, they will listen to their master, so if they're just there to scout and follow and kind of keep pressure on the players, and then throw them in for low levels as well. But if they're going into fight, then I would suggest keeping it for those higher levels. But consider using them because they really are a scarier version of something that can hunt you, that is a hound, I guess you could say. The next creature that we have on the list is one that 100% does not get used enough, and it is the Dryad. These Fey creatures have so much potential, and I'm a little upset that their challenge rating is so low. At a challenge rating 1, I think that's the reason why they don't get used as much. They do have some magical abilities, which is very interesting, but on top of that, the actual history behind them and why they've come to be can be very fun to play around with. In some cases, Dryads are actually tied to the environment area that they can no longer leave ever again. They are magically tied there and bound there. Usually it can be because they have actually frustrated and infuriated someone more powerful than them, another Fae, such as an Archfey, for example. And so this is their curse to forever stay here. Or it's because they have actually decided that they want to take care of this area. This is a place that they choose to protect because this grove is pure of nature. This place has been untouched by humans or other mortals, and so they wish to protect it and preserve that serenity, I guess you could say. So DMs, you can really play around with Dryads such as this because they can be great fonts of knowledge to pass on information. They can be protectors and actually have your players stay there and heal if they wish to and if they've made a good impression. On top of that, if your players or if someone else has actually destroyed the tree, the great tree or the great area that they have been tied to, a Dryad is actually sent into a rage, into a madness. Now, there's no difference between a Dryad that has gone mad and a Dryad that has not. in terms of stats. But personally, I would imagine that there must be some kind of change. So it would be really interesting to have this creature who was once a neutral good, I guess you could say, creature protecting this area go mad, and so it becomes more powerful because its abilities become more necromantic and necrotic because of the actual decaying of its body. Buff up its HP, give it stronger AC, give it a resistance or two to something other than just radiant damage maybe, or make it trickier, make it a problem that your players now have to deal with. Or on the flip side, have your players protect them, and that way they earn the trust of this dryad. They earn the protection of this dryad, where they can always come to its glade to heal and take time for themselves. Maybe these creatures have been around for 1,000 years or more, and so they have knowledge to give. I just think these creatures just don't get used a lot, and so I would encourage you as DM to read up on them more and to really throw them into your campaigns more often. All right, the next three we're going to kind of do all together because I think they're just really fantastic mini creatures that you can definitely play around with. They're really interesting. So the first one is your Blink Dogs. Now, Blink Dogs, again, low-level players are going to love them. They are basically dogs that are of Fey descendant, and they are neutral creatures. They can be tamed, I guess you could say, and they have the ability to blink in and out of existence. So, for example, they can basically Misty Step, I guess is the easiest way to think about it, 30 feet from one point to another they can see. And so you could have them be roaming around and hunting together, and that could be an issue. Or you could also have them become a pet that the players take on, and then it causes them some havoc. So Blink Dogs, really, really fun to play with. Moving on from that, you have your Pixies and your Sprites. Now, Pixies and Sprites are not the same thing. Your Pixies are more your fairies, I guess you could say. They definitely have this more angelic look to them, this more elven magical feel about them, which I think is really interesting. They're very curious, they're very playful, and they will definitely try and take things from your players, give them gifts, play games with them. They're kind of like the fairy dragons, I guess you could say, for the dragons, where again they're kind of like tricksters and they just enjoy having a good laugh. But your Sprites, for example, are more humanoid looking, with butterfly wings, I guess you could say, or dragonfly wings, and they're actually like protectors of forests. So they'll fly through with their little bow and arrows. And don't get me wrong, they can actually do a lot of damage. They can actually paralyze your NPCs or your players, depending on if they roll low enough, which can be really detrimental in a battle. But on top of that, they can also be reasoned with. Their intelligent creatures, and their main job is really to protect environmental areas. So you could have your players moving through a forest and then be ambushed by these extremely tiny little sprites that are flying around and shooting very tiny, dart sized arrows at them, I guess. So it can create this really interesting and funny encounter for your players to have a bit of a laugh. So those three creatures, always fun to put in. I definitely recommend using them because it just kind of livens up and pulls away from all the sad, dreary, and really serious moments of D&D. It gives you a moment to breathe, really, when it comes to combat. Finishing up with our honorable mentions, we have two that I think are important to think about when you are working with the Feywild. One is the actual elves from the Feywild, known as the Eladrin. They are a playable race for your players, so if your player is actually going to be one, it's always good to read up and get some knowledge on them, because they will eventually want to engage and communicate with their community. And then on the flip side, bringing back in that more evil Fey side, we have the Hags. All the Hags are actually Fey creatures, except for the Night Hag. Because they had such dark dealings, I believe they are fiends now. We'll probably get to that another time. Anyway, that's the video for today. Click on these videos here to keep up with what has been going on. Like the video if you enjoyed it. And next week, we are going to be looking at the elemental creatures. I'll see you then.